Hi ho, it's your Uncle Joe, and I'm here today with an album review. Now, the Monty Python comedy troupe flourished from about 1969 to 1983. During that time, they made television shows, movies, they did books and stage shows, but they also did a number of albums, generally excellent records. But the first one that they ever did was this one, Monty Python's Flying Circus from 1970, released in England by BBC Records and in America by Pi Records. Now in the 90s, I bought a box set called the Instant Monty Python CD Collection, and this was one of the few albums from that period that was not on there. And the reason is that the BBC still owns the rights to the album. Monty Python doesn't actually hold the rights to this particular record, which was marketed as a soundtrack to the TV show. Because of this book here, The First 200 Years of Monty Python by Kim Howard Johnson, I thought that the album was just the soundtrack to the television show, just the actual audio from the show. So I wasn't that interested in it, but I did buy this at a used record store. Actually, the book is not correct on that point. This is actually a live album recorded at the Camden Theatre in London. And these are then exclusive performances of some sketches that you probably know very well if you're a Python fan. Unfortunately, the audience that night did not laugh, so they had to add a laugh track. Now, the album is produced by Ian McNaughton, who directed most of the episodes of Monty Python's Flying Circus, and he also directed their first film, And Now for Something Completely Different. And this album is very much the audio equivalent of And Now for Something Completely Different. It's just sketches from the television show taken directly to another medium, in this case, an album instead of a film. Very little on this album is actually new or exclusive. As Monty Python progressed in making albums, they actually got more conceptual, more ambitious, both with the content and with the packaging of the records. So this, though, was like their debut. This was their raw debut. If you want to consider like the Monty Python to be the Beatles of comedy, then this is their Please Please Me. And just like with Please Please Me, the idea is get your act on record somehow. So nothing new, nothing that you probably haven't heard before, apart from just a few little things that were specially done for this record. But most of this material you'll know very well. In comparing it to And Now for Something Completely Different, there are a certain number of sketches that actually appear in both places. Nudge Nudge, the self-defense against fresh fruit bit, the lumberjack song, It's the Arts, and the Dead Parrot sketch are actually all in this. Now, I want to take a moment just to look at the packaging of the record. You'll see this is a Terry Gilliam foot crushing a television set. It says, warning, this album is original material from the TV series. And then it says, the worst of Monty Python's Flying Circus on the back. Most of the liner notes on the back are just positive reviews of the record, or actually of the television show by the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph, the Sun, the Washington Post, the Observer, the Morning Star. This is much more like a straight promotional item. They're not really trying to do anything really funny with the liner notes or the packaging, which is definitely different from what they'll do on their future albums. The liner notes are actually by Ian McNaughton, and they are very square. There's not really any jokes in it. It's just, the idea for Monty Python's Flying Circus was first talked over in a conference room in the BBC Television Centre. Around the table sat John Cleese, Graham Chapman, Terry Jones, Eric Idle, Michael Palin, myself, John Howard Davies, who directed the first 4 episodes of Monty Python, and Barry Took, who brought the 5 of us together under the BBC banner. Well, that's about it to say for the packaging. The interesting thing here is that it is credited to John Cleese, Michael Palin, Graham Chapman, that's Grahame Chapman, Eric Idle, Terry Jones, Carol Cleveland. Terry Gilliam is not actually listed, but he does appear in one sketch on side 2, and he is credited with doing the album cover. It's a sleeve designed by Terry Gilliam. And even here, Terry Gilliam is just borrowing imagery right from the television show, not really doing anything original. But now we've gotten this far. Is the album actually any good? Does it actually hold up? I would say yes. It's basically a live album, but it's recorded pretty well. The audio quality is good. The performances, even though the audience is not laughing, the audience is kind of dead during the whole thing. And so you hear this sort of pre-recorded laugh track. The performances are actually pretty strong. John Cleese in particular is in fine form here, hamming it up. I mean, he'd had a lot of experience performing on stage. I think most of them had by this point from their Oxford and Cambridge years. So, you know, they were pretty used to performing. And some of these sketches became staples of their live shows. And as the years went on, the sketches sort of mutated, you know, and they got a little wilder, and people got more comfortable with the parts, so they felt they could maybe stretch, you know, a little bit more with it. Here they hew pretty close to what was on the television show, but they're still, you know, they're still in pretty good form here. And the record is, I would say, fairly funny. The track names, however, are not particularly helpful on the back here. Some of them are accurate descriptions of what's on the album. Some of them not so much. Now, side one begins with Flying Sheep. That's the one where the farmer is watching the sheep try to fly, and he's trying to think of what the advantages would be of if sheep were able to fly. And I think it's ovine aviation. The highlight of this sketch is definitely Graham Chapman's accent. So it's a very visual sketch, so it's a weird choice to put on an album. But I guess that the conversation that Graham has is dialogue, but you don't actually have the image of, you know, the sheep opening up, and then there's the compartment inside where the passengers would be. So you really you don't get the full impact of the sketch on record, but they chose to include this on the album, and not only that, but start the album with it. There's a sketch then called Television Interviews, which is obviously not a very helpful title. This is The Man with Three Buttocks. And, you know, that's basically a dialogue sketch. It goes pretty well. After that is Nudge, Nudge. And here is really an example of, you can see how a sketch manages to mutate over time when they perform it live. I think they get a little bit more comfortable performing this thing live, and, you know, they're able to sort of take their time with it. Here it seems a little rushed, like they're trying to get through it and trying to get it over with. The mouse problem is next. Again, that's a very conceptual bit. Maybe works better on television than it does on record. John Cleese does a very good performance as a young man who's very shy and talking about wanting to be a mouse. But it goes over fairly well. Buying a Bed. Again, this is a sketch that may benefit from the visuals, but the performances are pretty good. The performance is pretty solid on that. Interesting People. I barely remember this track, I got to be honest. The Barber. And I think if you know The Barber, you know where it's leading. It's leading to Lumberjack Song, which is not actually listed on the title tracks here. Titles of the tracks doesn't actually list Lumberjack Song, but they do perform it in full. And Michael Palin sounds great here. He is fully confident in this part, and he can really sell it at this, you know. And then there's just a sketch which is called Interviews, and that's It's the Arts, the one where John Cleese is interviewing Graham Chapman as Sir Edward Ross, and he's calling him Edward and Eddie and Teddy Baby and Pussycat and all this kind of stuff. That is that sketch, and that's a pretty dialogue-heavy sketch, so that goes over pretty well. That's the end of side one, and at the end of side one, John Cleese actually comes on to say it's the end of side one, which is one of the few sort of exclusive things on the album. We go over to side 2, and it starts with Graham Chapman as the Colonel doing a stereo demonstration. And this kind of got ruined in the production because the album is actually in monophonic sound. He's actually going from one side to the other and saying, if you hear me moving from one side to the other, then the stereo is working, but the album actually is not in stereo. So it's still always funny to hear Graham as the Colonel. Children's stories, you know, that's the one where Eric Idle is reading from the children's book, you know, about contraceptives and the rough, tough sea captain who, you know, like to go to dockside bars, and, you know, these children's stories that get erotic right away, and he has to close the book and move on with a melon, you know, it's that bit. And this is a bit that Eric wrote for himself. He's obviously very comfortable with it, and that goes over pretty well. The Visitors. Now, this is the one where Graham and Carol Cleveland are having a private sort of date, and there's romantic music playing, and then all these rude people like Michael Palin and Eric Idle burst in. Off the name, but not my night, cha. And this is where Terry Gilliam is actually audible on the album as one of the guests. And for a sketch that also, again, benefits a little bit from the visual presentation, you know, you actually see all these crazy people crowding into the room on television. You don't get that here, obviously, but as an audio-only bit, it works fairly well. The Cinema. I have forgotten what that sketch actually even is. It's more of a, must be sort of a linking bit. The North Minehead by-election. Now, that title may not automatically flip a switch in your brain. That's where John Cleese is playing Adolf Hitler, who's still alive and living as Mr. Hilter in England, and he's running for a local election in England. Again, the visuals add an awful lot to this sketch, but it kind of rests on John's performance as Hitler, who is trying to disguise his true nature by passing himself off as a Brit. Me doctor is like, no, you patient, me doctor, and then me Tarzan, you Jane. There's this, it's almost sort of like an Abbott and Costello word association bit. And that's led by Eric Idle, and it's a funny enough little sketch. Pet Shop, that is Dead Parrot, of course. And Dead Parrot is one of those sketches that I just realized it doesn't really have like a strong ending. There's just like, there's no ending to that bit. So depending on which version, or, you know, whether they've done it for, you know, movies, TV, live shows, albums, they ended in a lot of ways. And this one just kind of peters out, but obviously at the height of it, it's pretty funny. And last but not least, we have self-defense. That's a self-defense against fresh fruit. Again, you know, in the real sketch, you have the 16-ton weight actually dropping down on the self-defense class. You have people actually charging at people with bananas as weapons. It's a very visual sketch. Again, though the performances sort of carry it, I guess, in its audio-only version. John Cleese, of course, as the instructor, sort of a drill sergeant type, yelling at his students, and Eric Idle keeps coming up with, "What about a pointed stick?" And I don't know. It's an okay way to present this sketch, you know, just audio only, but. I don't. It ends with a big explosion, which you just hear, and you don't actually. There's no video to this, so you just have to sort of imagine it. It's sort of theater of the mind. The weird thing, though, is that there's no real jokes at the end of it, so the album just sort of ends that way with this big explosion. it ends really without any sort of laughs. It ends with this very conceptual, high concept bit. So this is Monty Python's debut album from 1970. For Python completists, definitely is worth picking up, definitely worth checking out. I hope you enjoyed the review, and I will see you tomorrow.